More than 5,000 years ago, in the fertile lands between the rivers Tigris and Euphrates, humanity laid the foundations of what we now call civilization. This region, later named Mesopotamia, by the Greeks literally meaning the land between the rivers, became the birthplace of cities, codified laws, organized religion, and powerful empires. It is here that human society made the great leap from scattered agricultural villages to complex urban centers with monumental architecture, administrative systems, and far-reaching trade networks. Around 3,500 before Common Era, the Sumerians established some of the world's earliest cities, such as Uruk and Ur, introducing writing through cuneiform script, which preserved myths, records, and contracts on clay tablets. Over the centuries, other cultures rose to prominence. The Akkadian Empire under Sargon the Great forged the first known territorial empire. Later, Babylon under King Hammurabi became renowned for its celebrated code of laws, while the Assyrians built a military machine that spread fear across the Near East. Finally, the Neo-Babylonian Empire, under rulers such as Nebuchadnezzar II, transformed Babylon into a city of legendary grandeur, before falling to Cyrus the Great of Persia in 539 BCE. Mesopotamia was not only a land of rulers and warriors, but also of visionaries and innovators. Its inhabitants invented irrigation systems, mapped the stars, divided the hour into 60 minutes, and shaped mythological traditions that echo in later cultures and religions. Yet, it was also a land of constant conflict, where prosperity often gave way to conquest and decline. Even though the empires of Mesopotamia collapsed more than 2 millennia ago, their legacy endures. Every modern city, legal code, and written record carries a fragment of what first emerged along the banks of the Tigris and Euphrates, reminding us why Mesopotamia is truly the cradle of civilization. When we think of human civilization, images of towering temples, bustling markets, and mighty kings often come to mind. Yet, all of this began with something deceptively simple, a cluster of villages on the fertile plains of Mesopotamia. Over time, those villages transformed into the first great city-states, laying the groundwork for every urban society that followed. The journey from mud brick huts to monumental ziggurats is one of the most remarkable chapters in human history, and it begins around 3500 BCE with the rise of the Sumerians. The first cities, Uruk, Ur, Lagash, and Eridu by the mid-4th millennium BCE. Small farming communities along the Tigris and Euphrates rivers had grown into something unprecedented, cities. Among the most famous were Uruk, often called the world's first true city, Ur, which would later flourish as a center of trade and religion, Lagash, known for its local dynasties and temple wealth, and Eridu, considered by Mesopotamians themselves to be the very first city created by the gods. These cities were not just larger villages. They represented a completely new way of life, densely populated, organized around specialized labor, supported by large-scale agriculture, and governed by central authorities. Uruk, for instance, may have had a population of 40, 0 to 50,000 people at its height, a staggering number for the ancient world, and larger than many medieval European towns thousands of years later. What set these urban centers apart was not only their size, but their complexity. Within their walls, people no longer lived solely by farming. Instead, there were potters, weavers, metalworkers, priests, scribes, and merchants. This was the birth of specialized professions, a hallmark of civilization. The invention of writing, cuneiform, perhaps the most revolutionary innovation of the Sumerians, was their creation of writing around 30 to 100 BCE, known as cuneiform from the Latin word for wedge shape, describing the marks pressed into clay tablets. This script was at first developed for practical reasons. Farmers needed to record harvests, merchants needed to track trade agreements, and temple officials needed to store information about offerings. Early tablets show simple pictographs. A drawing of a jar might represent a measure of oil, while a symbol of a sheep might indicate livestock. Over time, these pictographs evolved into abstract symbols that represented sounds and ideas, giving rise to a flexible writing system. By about 2500 BCE, cuneiform, was sophisticated enough to record complex myths, hymns, and even personal letters. The impact of this invention cannot be overstated. Writing allowed ideas to outlive individuals, binding generations together through shared memory. It gave kings the power to issue decrees that could be preserved for centuries, and it enabled merchants to engage in trade across vast distances with contracts that could be trusted. Writing turned speech into permanent sand in doing so. It turned history itself into something we could remember. Ziggurats, monuments of faith and power above the flat Mesopotamian plains, rose immense structures that seemed to scrape the heavens. The ziggurats, these monumental, tiered temples were built of mud brick and often painted in vivid colors, standing as both religious and political symbols. The most famous, the Ziggurat of Ur, was constructed around 2100 BCE under King Ur-Nammu, rising some 70 feet high in its restored form, with multiple terraces, ramps, and a temple at the summit. It dominated the city's skyline. To the Mesopotamians, such temples were stairways between the human and divine realms, where gods could descend to earth and accept offerings. But ziggurats were not only places of worship. Their very scale demonstrated the ability of rulers to mobilize resources and labor. To build a ziggurat required thousands of workers, careful planning, and control over both the economy and the population. Every brick was a statement. The gods are powerful, and so are the kings who serve them. Organized urban life, the rise of cities, marked a profound shift in how humans lived. No longer was survival the only goal. People began to think in terms of community, order, and permanence. Agriculture and irrigation, the success of these city-states, depended on harnessing the power of the rivers. Vast irrigation canals were dug to control floods and distribute water, transforming arid plains into fertile farmland. Surpluses supported large populations and freed others from farming to specialize in crafts or governance. City walls, to protect against raids and rival cities, massive walls were constructed. Uruk's walls, described in the Epic of Gilgamesh, symbolized both security and civic pride. Markets and trade, cities became bustling hubs where farmers sold grain, artisans traded tools, and merchants dealt in exotic goods like lapis lazuli from Afghanistan or timber from Lebanon. Governance, leadership evolved from councils of elders to kings who claimed divine approval. With kingship came bureaucracy, scribes recording taxes, officials managing labor, and judges resolving disputes. Life in these cities was not easy disease. Warfare and inequality were constant realities, but they provided a degree of structure and opportunity unimaginable in a village setting. The psychological leap, the transformation from village to city, was not only material, but also psychological. For the first time, humans were forced to think of themselves as part of something larger, a city-state with laws, obligations, and shared identity. Living among thousands of strangers required trust, regulation, and a sense of belonging. Temples and myths gave people a common spiritual anchor. Writing and law gave them tools to organize disputes. Markets and festivals gave them reasons to gather. The very concept of civil society was born here, in the bustling streets of Uruk and Ur. This psychological leap from family and clan to city and state was perhaps the most important change in human history. Without it, no empire, nation, or modern city could exist. Why it matters? When we look back at these early Mesopotamian city-states, it is easy to see mud brick ruins and think of them as relics of a vanished past. Yet their innovations are everywhere in our lives today. Writing, urban planning, law, and monumental architecture all trace their roots to these first cities. But perhaps more important is the story itself, how ordinary farmers and craftsmen, faced with the challenges of floods, famine, and conflict, learned to build something greater than themselves. They created systems of organization, structures of belief, and tools of memory that allowed human culture to flourish. The story of Mesopotamia's origins is not just about temples and tablets. It is about the birth of the human imagination, the willingness to believe that life could be more than survival, that people could come together to build something enduring. Culture and religion, The world under the gods' life in Mesopotamia was inseparable from religion. The people of the Fertile Crescent believed that existence itself was under the control of divine forces. Storms, droughts, bountiful harvests, wars won or lost, and even personal fortune were all understood as the will of the gods. To live in Mesopotamia meant to live in a sacred order, where humans were both dependent on and fearful of supernatural powers. The Mesopotamian pantheon was vast and intricate, reflecting the complexity of life in a land that was both fertile and unpredictable. At the summit stood Anu, the sky god, symbolizing divine authority and the overarching order of the cosmos. Enlil, god of air and storms, embodied both destructive force and creative power capable of bringing fertility to the soil. Through rain or devastation through violent tempests, Inanna, later called Ishtar by Akkadians and Babylonians, embodied the paradox of human existence. She was simultaneously the goddess of love, fertility, and sexuality, and the goddess of war and political power. Her dual nature reflected the fragile balance between life-giving creation and destructive violence that characterized Mesopotamian society. As Babylon rose to prominence, Marduk became the chief deity. His ascension was not only a religious development, but also a political one, symbolizing Babylon's dominance. According to the creation myth Enuma Elish, Marduk defeated the primordial chaos goddess Tiamat and used her body to create the heavens and the earth. From then on, Babylonian kings emphasized their role as chosen by Marduk to maintain order on earth, linking the prosperity of the empire with divine legitimacy. Every Mesopotamian city-state had its own protective deity. Uruk was dedicated to Inanna, Nippur to Enlil, Babylon to Marduk, and Eridu to Enki, god of wisdom and water. Each city's identity was intimately tied to its patron god, and the temple off in the towering ziggurat was not only a place of worship, but also the heart of political, economic, and cultural life. Temples controlled vast tracts of land, employed workers, and managed resources. Offerings to the gods were redistributed as part of the city's economy, making priests key figures in wealth management. Religion was therefore not an isolated spiritual practice, but the backbone of administration, trade, and governance. The ziggurat, rising high above the city, symbolized the bridge between earth and heaven, a monumental reminder that the gods were ever present and that human society existed under their gaze. Priests occupied a privileged position in Mesopotamian society. They were not merely spiritual guides, but powerful administrators who interpreted divine will through rituals, omens, and sacrifices. Their control over temple complexes meant they oversaw agriculture, storage, and trade, turning them into key actors in governance. Kings themselves often began as high priests or claimed direct descent from divine powers to secure their legitimacy. The close link between religion and politics created a system where disobedience to the king could be seen as disobedience to the gods. The inscriptions frequently portray rulers as shepherds chosen by the gods to care for their people, reinforcing the idea that monarchy was divinely sanctioned. This fusion of religion and politics became a hallmark of Mesopotamian governance, influencing later civilizations from Egypt to Rome. Myth, epic, and the search for meaning in religious beliefs were not confined to temples and rituals, but were embedded in literature and myth. Among the greatest legacies of Mesopotamian culture is the Epic of Gilgamesh, composed around 2100 BCE. It tells the story of Gilgamesh, the semi-divine king of Uruk, who embarks on a quest for immortality after the death of his friend Enkidu. The epic reflects deep human concerns, the inevitability of death, the fleeting nature of glory, and the search for meaning in a fragile world. Gilgamesh ultimately learns that immortality is unattainable, and that human legacy lies instead in achievements and the endurance of civilization. These themes remain timeless, resonating across centuries as one of the earliest explorations of human mortality and purpose. Law and governance, the Code of Hammurabi. While religion provided moral justification, it was law that structured daily life and maintained order. The most famous legal milestone in Mesopotamian history is the Code of Hammurabi, issued by King Hammurabi of Babylon during his reign 1792 to 1750 BCE. Before Hammurabi, laws existed in customary and oral form, but they were often flexible, subject to interpretation by rulers or judges. Hammurabi revolutionized this by codifying laws and having them carved into stone stelae for all to see. By inscribing the code publicly, he created a new foundation for governance. Justice was no longer the private will of the king, but a matter of public record. At the top of the stele, Hammurabi is depicted receiving authority from Shamash, the god of justice, reinforcing that his laws were divinely sanctioned. This imagery sent a clear message. Obedience to the law was obedience to the gods themselves. The Code of Hammurabi contains 180 laws covering almost every aspect of life, property rights, trade, agriculture, family relations, debt, and even medical malpractice. One of its most famous principles is lex talionis, an eye for an eye, a tooth for a tooth. While this phrase suggests harshness, it represented a significant step toward proportional justice, ensuring that punishments matched the crime rather than being arbitrary. The code also reflected the stratified nature of Mesopotamian society. Penalties varied depending on whether the offender was a noble, commoner, or slave. For example, harming a noble demanded harsher punishment than harming a slave. In this sense, the code reveals both progress and inequality. Law was standardized, but not yet universal. Legacy of Hammurabi's code. The importance of Hammurabi's code lies less in its specific provisions than in its principle of codified justice. For the first time, people lived under a system where rules were written, known, and theoretically consistent. It established the expectation that rulers were not above the law, but were its guarantors. This idea had profound influence on later civilizations, from Mosaic law in the Hebrew Bible to Roman legal traditions. The concept that law should be written, public, and binding traces back to Hammurabi's Babylon. Political power, from Sumer to empire. The political history of Mesopotamia was one of constant change, marked by the rise and fall of city-states and empires. The fertile yet contested land fostered innovation in governance and warfare, producing some of the world's earliest experiments in empire building. The Sumerian city-states 3500 to 1000 BCE. The earliest political units were independent city-states such as Uruk, Lagash, and Eridu. Each city had its own ruler, often styled as Ensi, governor, priest, or Lugal, great man, or king. Competition for land and water led to frequent conflicts. Yet out of this rivalry emerged advances in administration, irrigation, and military organization. The Sumerians also developed early bureaucracies. Records written in cuneiform on clay tablets reveal taxation systems, trade agreements, and diplomatic correspondence, highlighting how governance became increasingly complex. The Akkadian Empire to 334 to 15 for BCE. The first great unifier of Mesopotamia was Sargon of Akkad, who forged the world's first empire. Sargon conquered the Sumerian city-states and extended his rule across much of Mesopotamia. His empire introduced centralized administration, standing armies, and a network of governors loyal to the capital at Akkad. Though the empire collapsed after less than 2 centuries due to internal strife and invasions, its legacy endured. The very idea of an empire, a political system uniting diverse peoples under a single ruler, was a Mesopotamian invention. The Old Babylonian Empire 1894 to 1595 BCE. Babylon rose to power under Hammurabi, who combined military conquest with legal and administrative reforms. His reign marked the height of the Old Babylonian period, when Babylon became a cultural and political center. After Hammurabi's death, however, the empire weakened and eventually fell to Hittite invasions. The Assyrian Empire 911 to 609 BCE of Sargon pioneered empire building. The Assyrians perfected it. From their capital at Nineveh, the Assyrians created a vast military machine. They were renowned and feared for their ruthless efficiency in warfare. Siege engines, iron weaponry, and cavalry gave them decisive advantages. Their reputation for brutality, including mass deportations and harsh reprisals, was not merely cruelty, but a deliberate strategy to instill terror and secure obedience. Yet Assyria was also an empire of administration. Roads, postal systems, and provincial governors helped maintain control over a sprawling territory. Libraries, such as the famous one of Ashurbanipal, preserve texts that remain invaluable to historians today. The Neo-Babylonian Empire 626 to 539 BCE. After Assyria's fall, Babylon experienced a cultural renaissance under Nebuchadnezzar II. The city became the jewel of the ancient world, celebrated for its massive walls, grand temples, and the legendary Hanging Gardens of Babylon, one of the seven wonders of the ancient world. Nebuchadnezzar also left a deep mark on biblical history, remembered as the conqueror of Jerusalem and the ruler who exiled the Jewish elite to Babylon. His reign illustrates how Mesopotamian empires were not only regional powers, but also actors in a wider Near Eastern world. The Neo-Babylonian Empire was short-lived, however. In 539 BCE, it fell to Cyrus the Great of Persia, marking the end of Mesopotamia's independent empires. Yet its legacy continued, woven into the fabric of world civilization. The civilization of Mesopotamia, from its earliest city-states to its grand empires, shaped the trajectory of human history. Its religion revealed humanity's search for order in a chaotic world. Its laws pioneered the principle of codified justice, and its empire set the stage for political models that would endure for millennia. Living under the gaze of the gods, the people of Mesopotamia built temples that touched the sky, wrote laws that bound kings and commoners alike, and carved out empires that defined what it meant to rule. Their legacy is not confined to the past. It echoes still in the institutions, stories, and systems of justice that define our world today.